Welcome to the second webinar in our policy series. This one is called Show Me the Money. It's about the student-centered funding formula and FACCC's position on it and our policy recommendations for improving our funding model. So presenting this webinar is Sarah Thompson. She is sociology and global studies faculty at Las Positas College, as well as the contract governor for FACCC. She's amazing. And she's also one of the co-chairs of our legislation and budget committee for FACCC that produced a fantastic position paper on the budget, which is sort of the birth of this conversation from FACCC about the SCIF and our position on it. So Sarah, I'll go ahead and let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Anna and Wendy and everyone. Thank you for coming. As Anna mentioned, this year, FACCC came out with a position paper on the California Community College funding models. This presentation on the student-centered funding formula is part of that paper. And I want to start by thanking all of the people who helped this paper and this presentation come together. Thanks to the Legislation and Budget Committee of FACCC and the other authors who helped create the position paper, Joshua Christ, Ruby Christian Brom, Daniel Judge, Dave Fouquet, Robert Stockwell, Michelle Haggerty, Emily Haroldson, and Libby Cook. Throughout this presentation, you're going to see quite a bit of data. And this is data that's been collected on the SCIF over the years. And I need to thank all of the people who have helped me compile this data. My chancellor, Ron Gerhard, my chief financial officer, Jonah Nicholson, my amazing director of research, Rajinder Samra, and my faculty association president, Dave Fouquet. As a sociologist, I know how to ask the questions, but I don't always know where the data is, and I sometimes need help with the math. So I am just so blessed to have so many mentors and co-conspirators, right, in our efforts to fight for the best funding formula possible for our students. This quote should really become the mantra for us this legislative season. Don't tell me where your priorities are. Show me where you spend your money, and I'll tell you what they are. We are going to hear a lot this spring, and probably more urgently this summer, about the horrible forecast for this upcoming year's budget. I am going to argue and hopefully convince you that this should not deter us at all in terms of protecting what funding we have and actually arguing for even more. Once you see how terribly underfunded we are as a system. Another quote, a budget is more than just a series of numbers on a page. It is an embodiment of our values. Again, as a system, we have been consistently underfunded and increasingly micromanaged by our legislators. Our legislators will tell us that we are valued, right? They say what we do is valued. Our students are valuable. But it's time for them to actually fund us to demonstrate that value that we have. So why a position paper? Why did we start with, a document of intent? And again, we have to come back to this historically persistent underfunding. The Legislative Analyst's Office comes out with an annual assessment of community college funding. And usually I love the LEO's office because I love data and they have access to it and often look at it in very creative ways. But this year's report was a little disappointing, largely because the LAO started with the assumption that we have been sitting pretty for the 5 years, since the student-centered funding formula began because of COVID. That we had enrollments drop, and so therefore we've had, this cushion, and now it's time for us, all right, to sort of put up, show up, or lose our funding. In fact, they even in this paper recommended some sort of punitive measures for those districts right? Not able to capture the same kind of revenue on the student-centered funding formula. However, this paper, their analysis was very limited because it did not do a historical analysis. In other words, look to see how much per student we used to spend, right, in the community college system. It also didn't do a system-wide comparison, comparing how much we spend on community college students vis-a-vis how much we spend on K through 12, CSU, and the UCs. So rather than sitting pretty over the past 5 years, we've actually experienced record numbers of underfunding that only the drop of enrollment made better. Another reason for a position paper is we've seen an over-reliance on models for efficiency for the California community colleges. And I'll get a little bit more into this later on in the paper. We needed a position paper because there are inherent problems with the student-centered funding formula. Now, some of these problems were inherited from the previous formula, but some are very specific to the SCFF itself. Another reason we need a position paper is that the effects of enrollment fluctuation on the stability of our funding has become an issue, particularly as we seek to recapture enrollment post-pandemic. And finally, the consistent role of outside forces, right, that are competing for and sometimes winning our legislature's hearts and minds. So the position paper covers a multitude of issues. It covers the SCIF, the student-centered funding formula. It studies the FTE calculation, or our per pupil expenditures. Today's presentation is going to go over both of those. But it also covers the 50% law, the 75-25% ratio, and the results of the 23 audit on faculty categorical monies. And finally, it looks at categorical revenues overall. So if you haven't had an opportunity to look at it, it's a very interesting read and hopefully very motivating for you in terms of how to talk to your administrators and, more importantly, your legislators about how we are funded. And that is how you would use this paper, right, as a resource for educating people on your campus and for educating your local lawmakers. You also would want to take a look at the repository of research and publications that are in the appendix, also accessible from the paper online, so that if you want to do a deeper dive, right, you have that ability. So why the SCIF? Let's take a bit of a historical approach to the development of the student-centered funding formula. Prior to 2019, the decade after the crash and the significant decrease in investment in revenues for the community colleges, indeed for all California public school systems, where we saw a real spike in terms of our enrollments. The economy sucked. People were coming to college. But over the 2010s, we saw a slowing decrease of enrollments. Some regions of California were hit harder by these decreases, particularly districts in rural areas, right, saw a decrease. And one of the challenges, right, of being a rural district is you don't really have a lot of pipelines, right? So once your enrollment goes down, it's very challenging to lift it back up. The previous funding model was based almost entirely on enrollments. So even small dips in enrollments could have big impacts on your allocation from the state. And so initially the SCIF was, it came from a good place. How can we remodel the funding formula so that it's based on more than just butts in seats, right? So it's based on more than just full-time equivalent students. However, it was put together too quickly and implemented too quickly, and it became a nightmare in terms of its operationalization. And so the creation of the student-centered funding formula ended up having some unintended consequences. It basically divided the states into districts that were, quote, winners and districts that were losers. These were actually the terms we used in 2019 and 2020 to describe the impact of the SCIF on districts, winners and losers. So I'm not being flippant. This was actually the terminology we used. It was immediately ascertained that most districts would lose money, particularly districts that were in urban, suburban, and high cost of living areas. So there was an oversight committee formed to evaluate some of the elements of this student-centered funding formula to see if they could fix it, right? Make it so it was more equitable, make it so that it worked better for more districts. However, the oversight committee suffered from this same sort of political environment that the rest of the system was in, which is that winners who were seeing an increase in their revenues without actually increasing their student body wanted to keep the SCIF, understandably so. But the loser districts who didn't lose students but lost revenue wanted to see a totally different model, which is also completely understandable. So the sides are literally pitted against each other. And this we saw in the Oversight Committee as well. And despite the fact that the Oversight Committee existed for almost 2 years, it resolved nothing in the fixing of the SCIF, right? So the Oversight Committee ultimately failed to create a better model. However, those failures aside, as our state and country and world were, evolving into the pandemic state, the SCIF was largely put aside. The decrease in enrollments across the state meant that basically every district was either on hold harmless, which meant they were on the funding formula prior to the SCIF, or they were on a SCIF hold harmless, which was called stability, right? Which meant that their funding didn't go down and they were just given the money they were given prior to the drops in enrollment. So with everyone on some kind of stability or hold harmless funding, really the problems with the SCIF were put aside, because let's face it, we had bigger problems, bigger challenges as a system to face. Last year in 2023, the Legislative Analyst Office did what they called sort of a post-pandemic report on, so how's the SCIF managing now, right? When we look at the districts across the state, and what they found is that only 2 districts, only 2 in the entire state, could actually match or increase their revenues on the SCIF model. That basically every other district would end up being a loser. So let's explore why. When we look at the student-centered funding formula priorities, right, how they actually fund different districts, we see that certain types of students become more valuable in the model than others. For example, full-time students taking 30 units or more annually become very valuable for a district in terms of meeting SCIF metrics. Transfer-oriented students are good, but they're best if they're receiving an ADT prior to transfer. In other words, a regular transfer student, not valuable, but an ADT transfer student, very valuable. And then low-income students receiving financial aid, either Pell Grant or Promise Grant or both, who are also full-time and transfer-oriented, that's the jackpot. The students who get deprioritized, right, in the student-centered funding formula priorities are non-traditional students, working students, students returning after gap years in education, part-time students, which ironically are the majority of community college students in California, and CTE students whose programs are expensive to run, but we receive limited funds per completer. So the SCIF really divides up our student population as well, not just our districts into winners and losers, but our student population into valuable students for us and not so valuable students for us. So I want to go ahead and explore this question, right, of the original intent of the SCIF, right? The original intent of the SCIF was to create a model that not only diversified how we get funded, right? So it's not just butts and seats, but there was also this attempt, and we heard this over and over again, to funnel money to our most vulnerable students. Funnel money to our most vulnerable students. And so 3 years ago, in a presentation Ron Gerhard and I actually did at the online FACC A&P, we took a look at this to see, well, if we look at who the winners are across the state and we look at who the losers are across the state, who are actually the students, right, that are populating, right, these winners and losers, and are we actually successful at funneling money to our most vulnerable students? So you have here in front of you the top 5 SCIF winners, all right, using data that started in 2021 and going through 2023. So again, a SCIF winner is one that saw the most significant increase, right, in revenues based on the SCIF model, without necessarily adding more students. And you can see the top 5, all right, the top 5 SCIF winners in 2021 were all of the rural districts, or 5 of the rural districts. And this was, again, intentional. There wanted to be additional funds funneled towards our rural districts because they were struggling the most under the previous model, which was definitely necessary to help these districts survive, particularly with the populations of students that they were addressing and the distance they had, their inability to necessarily connect with other districts close by. However, what I want you to take a look at as we, see who's in this district is to look at the different head counts. So the first row across, right, is head count. And that's not FTES, that is actually bodies, right? And one of the things you notice right away is the top 5, winners had very low student populations, right? The total population of the top 5 SCIF winners was just over 14,000, which represents 1%, right, of our total community college student headcount in California. I also added in there, all right, the per FTES allocation under the SCIF. And so Lassen, which was the biggest winner, had about 14,500 per FTES, and FTES is full-time equivalent students. That's different from head count. If you're confused about that, I get more into that later. And Mendocino, which was the 5th highest winner, was getting 9,800. right, per student. And then I did sort of a calculation of the different groups, as particularly the ones that were targeted because of equity gaps, African American students, Hispanic students, and then comparing that as well to, white non-Hispanic students. And I did combine Asian and Filipino, even though we do look at them as two different populations in the state. I combined them together because when we look at the top 5 SCIF districts, the population is so small, some of the numbers aren't actually statistically significant. So when we look at the total head counts of the winners, they have 1% of African American students in the state. They have 1% of the Hispanic students in the state, 2% of the white students, and less than 1% of the total Asian Filipino population. So I want you to think about these numbers for just a moment, because then we're going to go to the 5 districts that had the most to lose through the implementation of the SCIF. All right, so the bottom 5 SCIF losers, all of them are 20,000 and over, with the exception of Santa Clarita, which is almost at 20,000. So the first thing that we note is that the 5 districts who lost the most with the initial SCIF evaluation were large districts. Even look at Sonoma. Sonoma was the district that lost the most, all right, with the move to the SCIF. And their total population, their head count of 22,200 is already larger than all 5 top districts combined. All right, so we are looking at a significant number of students, right, who were in the most struggling loser districts. And if you look at the per FTES allocation under the SCIF, Sonoma, again, which was the lowest, was 5,900. And I want to remind you again, previously, right, what did we see? What did we see? We saw 9,800 and 14,500. So that is a significantly lower per FTS allocation, right? And Pasadena, which was the 5th from the bottom, all right, what came in at roughly 6,400, all right? So these are, you can see the difference in terms of investment per student. And then when we look at the head counts, we see a very different story as well, right? Where the bottom 5 districts serve 6% of the African American students in the state, 10% of Hispanic students, 9% of white students, and 12%, right, of our Asian Filipino student population. So when we ask those questions about, did the SCIF funnel money towards our most vulnerable students? It largely depended on demography and on demographics. Where did these students live? And if these students lived in more rural districts, then yes, the funneling was occurring. But if our vulnerable students lived in urban or suburban areas, the answer was no. And so let's dig in a little bit deeper into the SCIF and figure out why. Part of the reason why the SCIF is challenging for us currently is that with its over focus on completion and rewards on completion, it doesn't really focus on access. It doesn't focus on access. It doesn't focus on best practices for access. And so it lends itself to a certain mindset for strategies of how to generate the most revenue for a district. If you are going to get more money for students who complete, you are going to focus on the students that you can facilitate completing. And it doesn't mean that you have abandoned your mission. It just means that if that is how the funding model works, somewhere in the background, there's got to be someone targeting those populations so that the institution can survive. So our first policy recommendations in our policy paper deal with the student-centered funding formula overall. And our first recommendation is to extend hold harmless to 26-27. Currently, hold harmless or the stability funding is meant to run out in 2025. And we are hoping that we might have a more sympathetic governor to the community colleges once this one goes. And so if we could push hold harmless into the next term, we might have a more successful effort in modifying the model so that it works for more districts. We also recommend that COLA not be used as a punitive measure. Currently, both the governor and the LAO's office is recommending that districts that can't move into the SCIF be denied COLA moving forward, which is basically, if you don't get a cost of living increase, it's actually a cut. So they're literally recommending cutting the budgets of districts that can't meet their SCIF metrics. We recommend further evaluations of the effectiveness of the SCIF, not whether or not districts are meeting the SCIF or not, but the effectiveness of the SCIF in terms, for example, of reaching vulnerable students, of helping students be more successful, that sort of thing, from the Legislative Analyst's Office. But ideally replacing the SCIF with a model with a focus on stabilizing revenues, best practices, and access. So let's dissect the SCIF a little bit. The SCIF has 4 basic components. It has the basic allocation, which is sort of the startup funds that every college gets. And then the SCIF itself, the student-centered funding formula itself, has 3 different components. The FTES allocation, which is a nod to our old model, our butts and seats model. The supplemental allocation, which is meant to target our most vulnerable students, our students who need more support. And finally, the success allocation, which is considered kind of a carrot allocation, where as students complete and achieve things, we are rewarded for it with this component of the model. So let's start off with looking at the basic allocation. The basic allocation is, again, startup funds that are given to colleges based on their size. There's also a base allocation for centers, and that is also based on their size. Currently, the allocations for colleges are divided into small colleges, which are colleges that are under 10,000 FTES, medium colleges that are between 10,000 and 20,000 FTES, and large colleges, which are over 20,000. And just so you know, that these thresholds that we see under 10,000, over 20,000, they are completely arbitrary. There was no data-driven reason for choosing these thresholds other than probably some CFO was like, oh, this would be the easiest way to do accounting, right? 10,000, 20,000. It didn't really have anything to do with how many students are actually enrolled in the different colleges. And over the 2010s, even though we saw enrollment drop in the community colleges across the state, colleges that dropped from one level to another weren't penalized. For example, medium colleges whose enrollments dropped to under 10,000 were typically given a break, and like, well, you were at one point a medium college, And there were a few years where, oh, you have a couple of years to get your enrollments back up. But that wasn't codified into law. That was just precedence, right? That was occurring. And so our recommendation for addressing this part of the SCIF model is to change the thresholds to reflect actual California community college enrollments rather than arbitrary numbers. So if we looked at the actual enrollments, the category of medium colleges would actually be FTES between 8,500 and 17,000. Right? And small colleges would be those with under 8,500 and large colleges with over 17,000. The reason we're making these recommendations of changing the thresholds is they're actually based on the numbers of actual enrollments, so that medium colleges are actually our medium colleges. They actually, for example, include the median. This would also alleviate some of the stress that some previously medium colleges that are now under our current thresholds considered small would still be considered medium under these new numbers. That is our recommendation for fixing that part of the student-centered funding formula. But the biggest problem with the student-centered funding formula actually comes from a problem they inherited from the previous model, which is the FTES allocation, or the full-time equivalent student allocation. The current calculation of FTES for community colleges is unlike the calculation of FTES for any other public education system. The current calculation for FTES is 525 contact hours, or roughly 15 units of instruction per semester. So 15 units designates a full-time equivalent student. So if you have one student taking 15 units, that student is one student, or one FTES. If you have one student taking 9 units and the other student taking 6 units, you have 2 bodies, but that still counts as only one FTES. If you have 2 students taking 6 units and 1 student taking 3 units, that's 3 bodies, but under our model, it's still only one FTES. If you have 15 students taking 1 unit each, even though that's 15 bodies, that's only one FTES. So regardless of head count, FTES is designated as 15 units. And what this means is that many of our students, we aren't receiving enough funding for. For example, in my district, the Chabot Las Positas College District, if we look at 1920, I'll just take it back to pre-pandemic levels. Our FTES, our number of full-time equivalent students, was between 16 and 17,000. However, our head count, how many bodies we had on campus, was over 31,000. So we were literally only able to count, for state funding purposes, half of our students. No other system has to deal with this kind of phenomenon, with this kind of counting, right? This community colleges have the lowest FTE expenditures of all public education systems. So again, when we look at this number down here, when we compare the K through 12s at 17,500, the CSUs with 22,300, the UCs with 35,000, we are given, that should be a comma, my apologies, 11,360 per FTES. If you want to see how much we get per head count, per pupil, you would probably divide that in about half. So when we look at how much we spend as a state on California community college students, it is absolutely appalling. So where did this 15 unit calculation come from? It originates from an upper middle class education model, where the assumption is that college students are young adults who are being supported by their parents, living at home, and taking a full-time course load of 15 units in order to complete their degree in 2 years. This is actually a minority of our students, an extreme minority of our students. To see if you have, that kind of upper middle class privilege in your educational experience, if you are a family or you come from a family who can say to their student, going to school is your job, that is an indication of class privilege that most of our students just do not have. The irony of our 15 units is it's even higher than the federal and state definitions of full-time, which is 12 units. The CSUs, when they count full-time equivalent students, they count them at 12 units, not 15, but at 12. So that is where the 15 units originally comes from. We are the only system that uses that 15 unit measurement, largely because it is assumed that we can somehow, unlike any other education system, operate at an economy of scale. An economy of scale is when you can make things cheaper by making more things. For example, if you were to ship one television across town, the cost of shipping that one television would be, rent the truck, rent the apparatus to tie down the television, pay for the gas, and that's how much one television would cost. But if you put 10 televisions in the truck, then actually the cost of shipping each television becomes lower. And that's an economy of scale. Does not work for education, right? Does not work for education. Let's just take a look at counseling. How long does it take, or how much does it cost to give one 15-unit student an education plan? Well, it costs whatever it costs the salary of a counselor for 1 hour. So a 15-unit student costs 1 hour of labor from a counselor. Well, how much does it cost for a 9-unit student to have an education plan? It costs the exact same amount. It costs 1 hour of labor of a counselor. So there is no difference between the cost of a 15-unit student and a 9-unit student. So that 9-unit student and that 6-unit student who are making up that one FTES, each of them has to have an hour of counseling in order to create a student ed plan. And since the legislature, has basically dictated to us that all students should have education plans, that means that we are really not paid at an appropriate level because we are expected to treat each student as an individual, but we are not paid each student individually. The current FTES calculation does not funnel money to our vulnerable students because our vulnerable students largely aren't taking 15 units. Our most vulnerable students are often taking 6 units, 9 units, possibly 12 units if they are fortunate enough to have life circumstances where they can apply for financial aid and go to school with more units. But making, 2 6-unit students and 1 3-unit students share funding, that is not funneling money in the area which we need. And there are some student services that lower unit students actually use more than higher unit students. For example, on our campus, it is actually our part-time students and our non-credit students that use our computer center the most, not our 12 unit, not our 15 unit. So here's an example, right, of services that cost us more to service lower unit students. So how do we make this biggest part of our student-centered funding formula more student-centered? Well, first of all, by recognizing that statewide, only 9% of our students are enrolled in 15 plus units. 9%. So who are our students? Well, 51.4% take less than 8.9 units, with the median student load being 8. So our students are, for the most part, part-time students. Can you imagine a funding formula at the K through 12s or the CSUs being targeted at a minority of their students? No, their funding formulas deal with their majority. Our funding formula does not. The consequence of this is that we are funding most colleges for only 31% of their headcount. So if the 9-unit student really is our typical student, and we provide them services like college labs, tutoring, counseling, require students to have ed plans, orientations, we should have a funding formula that reflects this reality. Our funding model should reflect our students. So FACCC policy recommendation for looking at the recalculation of FTES is that we should move it from 15 to the state average of 9. But in all honesty, even moving it to 12 would increase our funding significantly, right? But the 15 just is doing too much of a disservice to our students. The second part of this SCIF, the supplemental allocation, which is 20% of the model, again, this is often termed like the equity portion, right, of our model, right? The purpose of the supplemental allocation, again, was to funnel more funds towards our most vulnerable students. Yet there are problems with how a vulnerable student is operationalized, how a vulnerable student is defined, right, in this model. Currently, a vulnerable student, the majority of students are identified for the supplemental allocation when they receive a Pell Grant, a federal Pell Grant, or a California Promise Grant. However, for many districts in high cost of living areas, urban areas, suburban areas, this is the part of the SCIF that does not work for them or that actually harms them the most. The reason being is that the income thresholds for the Pell Grant, right, are too low for the salaries in the high cost of living area. If we look at this chart in front of you, right, this table in front of you, the very top part is the California poverty measure as identified by the Center on Poverty and Inequality, right, the Public Policy Institute of California. And one of the things you notice is that poverty is pretty equitable across the state. Some areas are a little lower, like Sacramento and the Bay Area. LA is the highest. However, when you look at the chart underneath, this is the California College Promise Grant recipients. And the numbers are not equitable. You'll see two different areas highlighted in the top in the green, the Bay Area, which has a poverty measure of 15%, and the Inland Empire, which has a poverty measure of 16.6%. So the difference of about, 1.5. However, when you look at Promise Grant recipients, the Inland Empire has almost twice as many recipients, right, as the Bay Area. So it's not a reflection of poverty, it's a reflection of the thresholds that qualify students for federal and state financial aid. I mean, Sacramento on the top has the lowest, barely, the lowest poverty measure right, at 14.4, yet even for them, 48% of students are receiving promise grants. So without a cost of living measure, without a poverty measure in the supplemental allocation, students living in districts with high costs of living matrices are discriminated against, firstly in terms of qualifying for financial aid, but then their institutions are punished by having funding taken away because of the cost of living measure in their area. So our recommendation for the supplemental allocation is to integrate a cost of living metric and poverty index into the calculation. And finally, the last component of the SCIF, which is success allocation, which is 10% of the model. This is our, performance-based funding piece of the SCIF, theoretically rewarding districts for student success. But even within this, we see a multitude of problems. First and foremost is, again, how it's operationalized. How are you defining success? How are you counting success? The second problem is that it requires a great deal of data mining, which is very labor intensive and takes money away from students, contrary to the purpose of the model. For example, one of the things a lot of districts turned to when trying to capture as much of the success allocation money as they could is they started auto awarding certificates and degrees, which means that students don't have to apply for them. They're just automatically given that to them so that we can count them on our SCIF metric scale. The problem with this is that it actually requires quite a bit of human hours to ensure that all of your degree works are, accurate and updated, that all of your articulation for all of your ADTs are, accurate and updated, that all of your AS degrees are complementary with students perhaps who started them 10 years ago. It creates so much labor to be able to auto award degrees. And of course, none of this labor is directed towards students, it's directed towards capturing funding. Despite this, the success allocations are capped. We are only rewarded for so much success. If we go over our success allotment, we get a cheery pat on the back, but no extra funds. So they want us to be successful, but not too successful. A problem with performance-based funding just in general is that it has been experimented with since the 1970s in hopes that by rewarding institutions for successful students, it would improve student outcomes. But empirical research to date has demonstrated it doesn't. And in fact, it can actually encourage some really negative institutional behavior, such as creaming and gaming. Creaming is when you start to focus only on students who can succeed, right? By the definitions of success in the performance-based funding. We're seeing a little bit of this effect with AB 1705. So you focus on students who can do it and students who can't, well, or gaming, which is creating certificates that have dubious merit. In other words, creating a certificate for certificate's sake. And that, gaming the system, right? So it can lead to some negative institutional behavior. I have here some examples of the bias of the metrics or the bias of the operationalization, right, of the success allocation. And you can see what it rewards at the highest level are those students who complete associate degrees for transfer or ADTs. Not transfer, but associate degrees for transfer. If you scroll down You'll see that successful transfer to a four-year university only merits, right, the institution 600 or the district $660, or a third of what an ADT would merit. So you see this overemphasis on transfer, you see this overemphasis on ADTs, and you see that unless a CTE program has an associate's degree or an ADT, just completion of 9 or more CTE units is only 440. Yet those 9 or more CTE units could be the difference between a student not having a job and having a job. So there's a lot of, again, this upper middle class bias, right, built into the system, which leads FACC to make this recommendation, which is to eliminate the success allocation altogether. Altogether too problematic. So that brings me to the end of my presentation on the student-centered funding formula. And Anna, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all for taking this time out of your evening on a weekday night to join us. Thank you so much, Sarah, of course, for all the work you put into this and for this informative presentation. And we look forward to having you guys at the next policy webinar that we put on. Thank you for being here. All right.